Jake Harris never imagined he'd spend his Saturday night sitting in the dark, hidden behind a stack of hay bales, waiting to catch a middle-aged woman red-handed. But there he was, gripping a flashlight, eyes locked on the barn door, heart thudding with anticipation. The woman in question? Karen Thompson, the most entitled, meddlesome, lawsuit-happy neighbor in all of Butterfield County. And tonight she was about to learn the hard way that stealing from a farmer wasn't just a bad idea, it was a downright dangerous one. The barn door creaked open just past midnight. A silhouette slipped inside, moving with the kind of exaggerated stealth that only an amateur thief could manage. Jake held his breath, watching as Karen tiptoed forward, her designer handbag swinging awkwardly at her side. She wore a ridiculous outfit for a burglary: high heels, a leopard print coat, and enough jewelry to blind a cow. He could barely contain his grin. This was going to be good. Karen made a beeline for the metal milk storage tank, mumbling under her breath about how these farmers don't deserve to hoard all the good stuff. She flipped the latch and began scooping fresh milk into what looked like overpriced glass bottles. It wasn't the first time she'd done this. No, Jake had been watching for weeks. He had security footage, timestamps, and even a record of Karen reselling his milk at her ridiculous little roadside stand, branding it as artisanal, chemical-free, and farm-fresh. The nerve. Jake let her get comfortable, let her think she'd gotten away with it again. Then, with a sudden flick of his thumb, he turned on the flashlight and aimed it directly at her. Karen shrieked like a cornered raccoon, dropping a bottle that shattered at her feet. Milk splashed up her designer boots, and she flailed in place, her eyes wild with panic. "Well, well, well," Jake drawled, stepping out from the shadows. "If it isn't the Dairy Queen herself." Karen spun around, her expression shifting from shock to fury in record time. "You can't just sneak up on people like that," she barked, as if she wasn't the one breaking and entering. "I think I can," Jake said. "Seein' as this is my barn." Karen's nostrils flared, her hands flying to her hips. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice dripping with faux innocence. "I was just checking to make sure your cows are being treated properly. As a concerned citizen." Jake stared at her. Then, slow as molasses, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he pulled up the security footage of Karen's previous nighttime heist. "Funny," he said, holding the screen out to her. "You seemed real concerned about their well-being last week when you stuffed 3 bottles of milk into your Chanel bag." Karen's face went through several stages of denial, shock, offense, and then a twisted kind of defiance. "Milk should be free," she snapped. "You don't own nature, Jake Harris." Jake let out a slow whistle. "You're tellin' me," he said, taking a step closer, "that if I walked into your house and helped myself to whatever I wanted, you'd call that fair game?" Karen lifted her chin. "That's different." "Oh. Yes. Because you're a farmer and she hesitated. "I have allergies." Jake stared. "What?" Karen squared her shoulders, clearly doubling down. "I'm lactose intolerant," she announced. "Which means your cows are actually discriminating against me by hoarding all this milk." There were a lot of things Jake had been expecting her to say, but that wasn't one of them. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had no words. And then, as if to emphasize the sheer ridiculousness of the moment, Bossy, his oldest, most temperamental cow, let out a loud, wet snort from her stall. Karen jumped, her eyes darting to the animal like it had personally insulted her. "That thing just growled at me," she hissed. "She don't like thieves," Jake said. Karen took a step back, her shoes crunching in the broken glass. "I'm leaving," she said, reaching for the barn door. Jake leaned against the wooden wall, arms crossed. "That's the thing, Karen," he said, voice calm but firm. "You ain't leavin', duh." She froze. "Excuse me." With deliberate ease, Jake pulled the heavy sliding barn doors shut and latched them from the inside. A solid thunk echoed in the wooden structure, sending a visible shudder through Karen's shoulders. "You wanted the farm experience," Jake said. So you're gonna get it. Karen whirled around. You can't do this. Jake smirked. Pretty sure I can. Panic flashed across her face. This is illegal. Not more illegal than trespassing and stealing, Jake pointed out. Karen stomped her foot, clearly expecting that to carry some weight. Unfortunately for her, the cows remained unimpressed. Thunder, the largest and meanest bull on the farm, snorted from his corner, his sharp horns catching the faint glow of moonlight. Karen swallowed hard. Let me out, she said, voice an octave higher than before. Jake leaned against a wooden beam. Tell you what, he said. I'll let you out in the morning. Karen let out a strangled noise. Morning? Yep, Jake said easily. You can spend the night gettin' to know the cows. Maybe then you'll appreciate 'em a little more. Karen opened her mouth, probably to scream, but before she could, Bossy let out another loud moo and took a bold step forward. Karen yelped, scrambling back and bumping into a pile of hay bales. Jake grinned. He could already tell this was going to be the most entertaining night he'd had in a long, long time. The cows, on the other hand, were just getting started. Karen pressed herself against the barn wall, eyes darting wildly between the cows. Her expensive leopard print coat was now dusted with hay, and the panic in her expression was growing by the second. Jake stood near the door, arms crossed, enjoying every bit of her unraveling composure. He had spent years putting up with her entitled nonsense, but tonight, the tables had finally turned. Bossy took another deliberate step forward, letting out a deep, throaty moo that echoed through the barn like a war cry. Karen flinched, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She lifted one hand as if to reason with the cow, palm up, her manicured nails gleaming under the dim barn light. Nice cow, she said, voice trembling. Good cow. There's no need for hostility. Thunder, the massive bull standing a few feet away, let out a warning snort and kicked up a bit of straw with his hoof. Karen's eyes practically bugged out of her head. Oh my God, she gasped. That one is plotting my murder. Jake chuckled. Thunder don't like intruders. Especially the milk-stealing kind. Karen's head snapped toward him, her face a mix of rage and fear. You can't just leave me in here with these things, she screeched. This is animal cruelty. This is... Before she could finish, one of the younger cows, Daisy, trotted up and gave her an enthusiastic nudge with her wet nose. The force of it sent Karen stumbling back into a pile of hay. She flailed, arms waving wildly as she tried to regain her balance, but it was too late. With a high-pitched yelp, she toppled backward, her coat flaring out like a parachute. Jake burst out laughing. Well, would you look at that, he said, shaking his head. Daisy likes you. Karen, sprawled out in the hay, let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. She scrambled to her feet, panting, her face red with fury. This is not funny, she snapped, brushing hay from her sleeves. You can't keep me locked in here like some kind of... A loud, wet noise interrupted her. Karen froze. The barn fell silent. Jake's grin widened. Slowly, Karen turned her head toward the source of the sound. A few feet away, one of the larger cows had lifted its tail in a way that only meant one thing. Oh no, Karen whispered. A second later, a fresh pile of cow manure hit the wooden floor with a thick, unmistakable splatter. Karen let out a strangled gagging sound, stumbling backward with a look of sheer horror. Jake slapped his knee. Welcome to farm life, Karen, he said, still laughing. Karen's hands clenched into fists at her side. I swear to God, Jake Harris, when I get out of here, I'm going to sue you into the ground. Jake wiped a tear from his eye. Oh, I'd love to see you explain to a judge how you broke into my barn to steal my milk and ended up knee-deep in cow crap. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She knew he had a point. The cows, seemingly unbothered by the chaos, had started to gather around her. Karen took a cautious step back, but the barn was only so big, and the animals were far too curious about the new visitor. One of them, a particularly pushy Holstein named Bessie, leaned in and gave Karen a long, slow lick up the side of her face. Karen shrieked. Jake doubled over laughing. "Oh man," he wheezed. "I should be filming this." Karen wiped at her cheek furiously, looking like she was on the verge of either vomiting or breaking something. "That's disgusting. This is harassment. I demand to be let out right now." Jake shrugged. "Not happenin' da." Karen huffed, spinning on her heel and marching toward the barn door. She grabbed the handle, yanked hard, and nothing. The door was locked tight. She turned back to Jake with pure murder in her eyes. "You are going to regret this," she hissed. Jake gave her a lazy smile. "Doubt it." Just then, another cow trotted up behind Karen, a bit too eager to get in on the action. Without warning, it nudged her square in the back, sending her stumbling forward. She barely managed to catch herself before face-planting into another fresh pile of manure. Karen let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a sob. "That's it," she shouted, whipping around. "If you don't let me out, I'm going to." But she never got to finish her threat. Because at that exact moment Bossy, the ringleader of the cows, decided it was time to make things interesting. In one smooth motion, the massive cow raised her head and nudged Karen's handbag off her arm. The bag hit the floor with a dull thud. Karen gasped, lunging for it, but before she could grab it, Bossy stepped forward, planting one large hoof directly on top of it. Karen's scream was deafening. "No. That is a limited edition Dolce & Gabbana." She clawed at the bag, but Bossy refused to move. Jake leaned against the wooden beam, watching the scene unfold like it was the best show he'd ever seen. "Looks like Bossy don't care much for designer brands," he mused. Karen was too busy trying to wrestle her bag out from under the cow to respond. She grunted, yanked, and then, rip! A seam tore down the side of the bag. Karen froze, staring at the damage like her entire world had just come crashing down. "You," she whispered, turning to Jake with eyes that could melt steel. "You will pay for this." Jake merely grinned. "Pretty sure I ain't the one who brought a $1,000 purse to a barn." Karen let out a furious scream and kicked at a loose piece of hay. The cows, completely unfazed, went about their business, some lying down, others nudging the empty milk bottles Karen had dropped when she first got caught. Jake glanced at the time. It was getting late and he was about ready to head to bed. But he wasn't about to leave Karen alone in the barn without making sure she learned her lesson. "Hope you like the company," he said, pushing off the beam and heading toward the loft where he kept spare blankets. "I'd recommend Findin, a good spot to sleep. Bossy don't mind sharin' hay." Karen's horrified expression was pure gold. "This isn't over," she muttered. Jake just smirked as he climbed the wooden ladder to the loft. "Oh, I sure hope not." The first light of dawn crept through the barn's wooden slats, casting golden beams across the straw-covered floor. Jake stretched from his makeshift bed in the loft, yawning as he sat up. The sounds of the animals stirring filled the space, soft snorts, the occasional shuffle of hooves, and one very distinct, very human groan of misery. He peered over the edge of the loft and spotted Karen curled up on a pile of hay, looking like she'd spent the night in a battlefield. Her once pristine leopard print coat was now more hay than fabric, her usually flawless hair was sticking out in every direction, and the expression on her face suggested she had just experienced the longest, most traumatic night of her life. Jake grinned as he climbed down. "Mornin', sunshine. Sleep well." Karen glared at him through bloodshot eyes. "I hate you." He chuckled. "Thought you might." She sat up slowly, groaning as she stretched. "My back feels like I was run over by a tractor." "Well," Jake said, rubbing his chin, "technically, you were just slept on by Bessie for a bit. She tends to cuddle when she likes someone." Karen's face twisted in horror as she whipped around to find the giant cow resting peacefully behind her. She shot to her feet so fast she nearly tripped over her own shoes, brushing at her coat as if trying to rid herself of any lingering cow germs. Jake took his time unlocking the barn doors. The morning air rushed in, crisp and cool, bringing with it the scent of fresh grass and damp earth. Karen practically bolted outside, gulping in the fresh air like she'd been released from solitary confinement. She turned on him the moment she regained her composure. "You are going to regret this," she hissed. "I will ruin you, Jake Harris. I will sue you for unlawful imprisonment. I will call the police. I will." Her threats were cut short by the sound of a truck pulling up the driveway. Jake smirked. "Oh, good timing." Karen's brow furrowed as she turned to see Sheriff Tom stepping out of his patrol truck, adjusting his belt. The man was built like an oak tree, solid, unshakable, and completely uninterested in nonsense. "Morning, Jake," the sheriff greeted, then raised a bushy brow at Karen's disheveled state. "Well now, you look like you've had an interesting night." Karen straightened her coat, attempting to salvage some dignity. "Sheriff, I need to report a crime," she snapped, pointing at Jake. "This man kidnapped me and locked me in a barn against my will." Sheriff Tom sighed. "Karen," she huffed. "What?" The sheriff reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a notepad. "Before you start throwing around accusations, let's go over a few details. Number 1, we got security footage from Jake's barn that shows you breaking in. Number 2, we've got clear evidence of you stealing milk. And number 3, you are trespassing on private property." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sheriff Tom flipped the notepad shut. "Now, Jake here had every right to call me last night and have you arrested. But instead, he let you sleep it off in the barn. So before you go talking about lawsuits, you might want to think about which side of this mess you're standing on." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. "But..." Sheriff Tom held up a hand. "Now, if you're feeling real determined to take this to court, I'll be happy to write up a report. Course, that means you'll be fastened trespassing charges, theft charges, and possibly an animal cruelty charge, depending on how Bossy felt about you last night." Karen's jaw tightened. She looked from the sheriff to Jake, then back again. Finally, with a forced smile, she crossed her arms. "I'll let this one slide." Jake chuckled. "Mighty generous of you." The sheriff sighed, shaking his head. "Karen, you ever just try buying your milk like a normal person?" Karen let out an indignant scoff. "I don't see why I should have to pay for something that comes from a cow and should belong to the community." Jake snorted. "Yeah, well, by that logic, I ought to be able to walk into your house and take your fancy coffee machine, 'cause caffeine should belong to the community." Sheriff Tom gave her a pointed look. "I suggest you get on home, Karen." Karen muttered something under her breath but turned on her heel and stalked toward her car. She yanked the door open, then paused, glancing down at herself. The realization of her current state seemed to hit her all at once. The ruined coat, the hay sticking out of her hair, the faint scent of cow manure clinging to her like a bad decision. She groaned, slamming the car door shut behind her as she sped off down the dirt road. Sheriff Tom turned back to Jake, rubbing his temples. "You really locked her in with the cows?" Jake grinned. "She got exactly what she deserved." The sheriff sighed. "Well, at least I won't have to hear her complain about the milk prices for a while." Jake watched the dust cloud from Karen's retreating car fade into the distance. "You think she learned her lesson?" Sheriff Tom chuckled. "Not a chance." Later that afternoon, Jake checked his phone and nearly dropped it when he saw what had happened. Someone had leaked the security footage from the barn. Karen's dramatic entrance, the cows knocking her over, the milk bottles spilling everywhere, and of course, the moment she lost the tug-of-war with Bossy over her designer handbag. The video had gone viral. The comments were ruthless. "Rich lady learns farm life the hard way. Justice for the cows. I'd pay to see a sequel." Jake grinned. The internet had taken care of the rest. Karen's name was now trending, and she had become the unwilling star of a brand new meme. By sunset, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Karen standing there, arms crossed, looking like she had just chewed through a lemon. He raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "I need this situation to disappear." Jake leaned against the doorframe. And what situation would that be? Karen exhaled sharply. The video, the comments, the memes. He smirked. That situation. She clenched her fists. I will pay you to take it down. Jake pretended to consider it for a moment before shaking his head. Nah. I think it's doing too much good for the community. Karen's eyes flared. You! Tell you what, Jake interrupted. I'll make you a deal. You work on the farm for a week. No complaints, no attitude, just real hard work, and I'll talk to my buddy who uploaded it. Maybe he'll consider talking it down. Karen's expression went through a series of rapid transformations: shock, disgust, rage, and finally, reluctant acceptance. Fine, she muttered. Jake grinned, stepping aside and gesturing toward the barn. Great. You start now. Hope you don't mind gettin' a little dirty. Karen groaned but stomped past him, her designer boots sinking into the mud. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. This was going to be fun.